All right. Think I'm live. Like everyone says, right in the beginning. This is kind of the magic of live streaming here. I hope I'm live, and I hope you can hear me. If you can, please give me a little bit of a bit of a heads up here going on. And I'm actually going to do this too. Let's see. I'm going to go play and. Hold on. Here we go. I'm just gonna drag this sucker up. All right, so here we go. Hi everyone, my name is Jonas. Welcome to this Earth Live lesson that is put together by my friend Lizzie Daly. If you haven't seen this whole playlist before, I highly encourage you to check it out. If this is the first time you're visiting this, there's a whole list of great people working with conservation and wildlife and filmmaking and documentary stuff. And I highly encourage you to go and check out all of the other talks that are on this list that Lizzie put together. Some great people and awesome research going on. If you can hear me well, please give me a thumbs up. I can see that some people are coming in already. The magic with this whole live thing is that it's a little bit of a weird situation because I can't see you face to face. And it's also a little bit of a delay. So when you write in your questions, which I also encourage you to do, write in as many questions as you want. It takes me a little while to see them. And it's also kind of this odd kind of delay between responses. So write in your questions, and I'd love to see them, and I'll try to get to them as quickly as possible as well. If you are viewing this this little lesson session afterwards and not actually live, also I would like to encourage you to write your questions in the comments below, and I'll get back to this video and I'll try to respond and answer as many as possible later as well. So my name is Jonas Stenstrom, and I am a biologist, and I'm also a science filmmaker. And the title for this session here was Tales from a Wildlife Filmmaker and Scientist. And that sounds a little broad, I think, but it also explains kind of well what I do, because I have a background in science, but I do science videos, filmmaking stuff, but on a really broad scale. So everything from chemistry to biology. Biology is my background, so that's kind of what I'm doing most of. The thing is, I started in science, and the problem was that I always felt that there were too many things that I felt interested in when it came to science. I could not just narrow things down to one field, but there was just too many things that I wanted to do. And I also found the more that I learned, the more I wanted to share with other people what I learned, because the natural world is such a fascinating place. If you just take your time to just like stop and observe, there's so much stuff going on. And over the last few years, of course, this is going to happen. So with every live session, especially, there's going to be technical issues. I had a whole different setup planned initially, but then, of course, as always, there were, oh, God, damn it. Sorry. This is, okay, here we go. So I had all kinds of different things set up here, but then, of course, this was going to mess me up. So, give me 1 second. I promised myself I wasn't gonna. This wasn't gonna happen, but unfortunately, it always does. I had a plan to actually have this all stream on the screen as well, but it somehow didn't work. It's always the thing with technology, isn't it? So I have a question already, some top tips for those who want to get into science communication. And I want to get to that, but I'm going to get to that in a little bit. So first, I just want to give you a little bit of my background. So I started in marine biology. This was basically what I felt passionate about when I was studying, when I was in school. I loved the ocean, and I started diving, and I got into marine biology, and I moved to to Australia actually to study marine biology. So I studied on the Great Barrier Reef, and my passion has always been in biodiversity. So seeing just the diversity of life around us, and this is something that is extremely apparent when you get to, for example, Australia and the Great Barrier Reef, where I was. On the Great Barrier Reef, there's just incredible. It's just diversity of life is insane. And I should have done what everyone else was doing and narrow things down into one field. But again, I started broadening things instead. I went out and I just felt that there were too many things. I was branching out from the marine science that I was doing, and I was just learning things about terrestrial animals and spending time in the rainforest. And I was doing a lot of this documentation stuff, traveling together with my friend and colleague Rob Nelson, who has also done a speech here on the live lessons. So you check that out. He was talking about his visit to Chernobyl. And we were both working as teachers and educators at the time, and we felt that there was just so much fun stuff that we can bring back to the classroom and share our own personal stories from the wild, which was fascinating. And it also brings a connection to these issues that you want to communicate with your students. So I'm basically self-taught in filmmaking, self-taught in photography, and have done that for many years, more years than I'd like to admit right now. Anyway, I spent the last probably 10 to 15 years traveling and documenting science and wildlife. I always felt that the reason why I want to get into this, nowadays I get the question whether I am the filmmaker, the photographer, and a lot of times I feel a little bit hesitant to say yes to that, but it is true, of course. And the reason why I feel hesitant about it is the fact that this whole thing kind of came from my passion to wildlife. I wanted to share stories from the wild. I wanted to promote conservation, promote awareness of the natural world. And that's the reason why I even got into photography and filmmaking, I would say. Even though I love it, if I was to go to a deserted island, I would always bring a camera. It would keep me busy for a long time. So I always felt also that, you cannot protect what you don't know about. If you don't know something exists, it's going to be really hard for you to protect it. And I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this. If I was to ask you for some animals that are currently struggling, endangered species, I know a lot of you would probably be able to name several. For example, elephants, definitely, things like orangutans. I know it's a little odd, a little dark on the screen, but you get the idea. But there's also so many species that we don't maybe hear about as much, that are also extremely important for the ecosystem, for biodiversity, and for many other species. So lately, I've been extremely fascinated by the idea of telling stories about things that we don't necessarily know so much about. And that's kind of what I want to get into a little bit today. So that was a little bit of a long introduction, but today I want to talk a little bit about the project, or let you in on the first details on a project that I'm working on currently, talking about species that I think are extremely fascinating, extremely interesting, but a lot of people might not know so much about, might even not know exist. And one of these animals that I am currently building a segment on, or a part of this Brigade project on, relates back to my marine background as a marine biologist. And that is actually, it's a coral. And I know probably several of you are probably going to say, well, we know about corals. That's not new to us. And didn't he just say that he was going to talk about animals that we don't know about? Well, in a way, I'm glad you asked, because hopefully by the end of this, I will be able to check that box as well. Because, when it comes to corals, and this is fascinating to me, I went down to Australia to study my undergrad, and I had never really been to a coral reef before. And my first dive on the Great Barrier Reef it just blew me away. It was magic. You come down there and you just see all this complexity, all this life is right in front of you, and you're in amongst this whole ecosystem that is just absolutely mind-blowing, breathtaking. But the funny thing is, and this is what people, when you Google a coral reef, oh my goodness, I wish I could blow this up. I'm gonna see if I can do it now. Here, when you Google a coral reef, this is pretty much what you will see. You will see a bunch of pictures on tropical, colorful coral reefs, clear water, and lots of fish, lots of animals. If you go through a stock footage library of coral reef images, this is pretty much always what you will see. You will have colorful fish, you have colorful coral, a lot of life. And this is what I experienced when I was studying in Australia. But as amazing as this is, it is, and is not at all, untrue, because when you Google coral reefs, this is essentially the biggest, this is what represents coral reefs. But it's not the full story, and that's what I find interesting. Because if you look at these researchers, for example, these are researchers here at the University of Gothenburg here in Sweden. Believe it or not, but these people are also studying coral reefs right here. So this could also be a coral reef study. So what I'm doing right now is teaming up with actually some of these researchers here and other people to document an environment that I find extremely fascinating, and not just interesting, it's also extremely important to a lot of us, to humans, to many species, and that is cold water corals. And this is something that people usually don't talk about. I know that there's going to be a lot of talks here about tropical corals and stuff like that, but this is what it looks like if you were to go down to a little deeper and take a look at these cold water corals. So this is Lophelia pertusa. It's a cold water coral that lives, the shallowest places people have found it so far is about 40 meters, but it goes down to a couple of thousand meters deep. So it's pretty amazing, and it's almost eerily white. If you look at the color of these corals is not at all like the tropical corals that you would find for example, the Great Barrier Reef. So these are all bright white. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot of, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of diversity in the corals that you see here. So let's see if I can bring that down again. And the thing is here, I just wanted to sort of bring it back to the beginning. First of all, what is a coral? Well, a coral, when I was on the Great Barrier Reef, I used to do a lot of guided tours to divers and snorkelers on the reef. And my first question was, do you think a coral is an animal, a plant, or a rock? And a lot of times they used to answer animal. That was the most common answer. But I used to say that the corals, referring to the corals on the tropical coral reefs on the Barrier Reef, the answer is a little bit of all three. So I gotta bring this out. I have a coral colony here that is bright white. This is a tropical coral. Looks very similar to the cold water coral that I showed you on the screen. Let me just first say, this is not something that I have collected myself, and I have not bought it. I would never buy or encourage anyone to buy a coral like this. If you go to a tourist shop, I would highly recommend stay away from buying this stuff. This actually, I inherited this from my grandfather. So this coral colony, or this skeleton of a coral colony, is probably 60-70 years old, from a time when they actually didn't know better. Breaking off corals like this would be extremely destructive to a coral reef, but I'm using it for educational purposes, so I see a purpose of having it here now. If you take a close look at this, all these little knobs sticking out here, those are single polyps, or used to be single coral polyps. That's the animal coming out of each single little point. This one's bright white, but if we go back to the tropical coral reefs that you saw before and you see the pictures of all these colorful corals that make up this tropical coral reef, that is actually a symbiotic plant or an algae that lives within the tissues of the coral. It's called a zooxanthellae, and it's this tiny microalgae that uses the sunlight to photosynthesize, and that process basically provides most of these tropical corals with most of the energy that they need to survive. So they don't need to do a whole lot more than just kind of host these plants, these microalgae, to be able to get the energy that they need. That's part of the color, actually, that you see. That's not the whole story, but that's mainly why tropical coral reefs are so colorful. The other thing is the coral polyp, the animal, they secrete this hard skeleton of it's a calcium carbonate kind of skeleton, and that becomes the rock aspect of the coral. Now, if we go back to these cold water corals that I had here before, and you look at these, they are actually bright white, and part of that is because they don't have the zooxanthellae symbiotic relationship. Instead, they feed. Well, so what you see the coral skeleton like this coming through. There's no symbiotic algae that causes that coloration. So basically, the coral is a little bit of all three, but when you look at the temperate, cold water, deep water corals, you would say take the whole animal part, the plant part out of it, and it's a rock in the animal. So back to this tropical coral reefs, the colors, mostly because of the zooxanthellae algae, and then if you look at a map of where corals are actually found, you'd see that all the red ones here, those are tropical coral reefs. But the cold water, deep water corals that not a whole lot of people know about, those are the little blue sections up here. That's actually it's the corals are actually found in pretty much all waters on this planet. Normally, we just say that they found in tropical waters, but these cold water corals are found all over, up in the Arctic and here off the coast of Scandinavia. And the next, let me show you. This is a bit of a close-up here of this as well. This is kind of what they look like, a close-up. This is one single coral polyp. And the big difference here is that since they don't have the symbiotic algae, instead they're relying on filtering the water for plankton and particles in the water to feed. So they have these tentacles that they use to catch prey in the water. So do tropical corals as well. But since they have the symbiotic relationship with the algae, they don't rely. Well, they basically have to. They get most of the energy from the plant photosynthesis activity instead, whereas these guys have to basically catch all of their food instead from the water. All corals belong to the phylum Cnidaria, meaning that they are related to jellyfish, anemones, and hydras and stuff. What that means also is that they all have something called nematocyst. It's a stinging cell. So in their tissues, they basically have a little harpoon-like structure that shoots out when it's being touched or brushed, and that shoots out and stuns a potential prey that gets close to these tentacles, and that's how they catch their prey. So right now I'm working with scientists and some other people to try and document these reefs here off the coast of Scandinavia. And it's not an easy thing because they are deep living. The reefs that we have off the coast of Sweden are about 100 meters down, 80 to 120 meters down-ish. So right now, we're trying to set up an expedition where a friend of mine, Oliver Stubbs, and his team of commercial divers are going to go down to just below 100 meters to actually try and document these corals with real cameras instead of remotely operated vehicles, which is what most people have to use to be able to document these animals. So for researchers that do these studies, what they have to do is they basically have to bring a lot of these coral polyps up, or colonies up, and bring them to the lab and then study them. And a lot of the studies that have been done lately have been related to how they disperse and how they move to different areas. So Susanna Strömberg from the University of Gothenburg sent me this image here, which she basically documented the release of eggs into the water, which is pretty amazing. So they have a synchronized release of eggs into the water to be able to get fertilized and dispersed to new areas. So here we go. What I was going to say is there is a lot of talk about corals being, well, damaged, and there's a lot of them being threatened on coral reefs all over the world. And that's no difference here with these deep sea corals as well. A lot of these deep sea cold water corals are struggling for several different reasons. One being deep sea trawling, big trawls that are really destructive, that kind of mow the bottom sediment and just crush a lot of these corals. And then, of course, like tropical corals as well, a lot of problems with ocean acidification, basically the ocean taking up more carbon dioxide, becoming slightly acidic, which affects this calcium carbonate skeleton quite a lot, because it dissolves this calcium carbonate. It's actually something that you can see too if you want to test this out. I just brought this in just to give you an idea. A lot of this, like this little coral fragment I had here from something I found on the beach when I was in Australia, and I put it here. I'm just going to show you a little bit of an experiment that you can do as an educator. This is acetic acid or vinegar, and you can see how it starts bubbling. That is just a quick demonstration of the effects of an acid on the calcium carbonate skeletons that make up corals. This one's pretty strong. I diluted the acetic acid before quite a lot, and it was still fizzing and bubbling like crazy. So it doesn't take much for them to get damaged by acidic conditions. And what happens is, a lot of the times the coral itself is actually covered up by the living tissue, but right at the base of the coral, where it attaches to the hard sediment that it sits on, that's usually naked, exposed. And when that gets damaged, when that gets exposed to acidic conditions, it starts dissolving, actually collapsing the whole coral. So that's one of the main issues that these things are dealing with right now as well. Whoops. Here we go. This is hard managing the whole thing. All right, so when I talked about this initially, I said that these are the coral reefs that you will never snorkel. And right now, I think you will probably agree with me that it's kind of difficult to get to these reefs. We're looking at probably 80 to 120 and down to a couple of thousand meters depth. And you would probably think that, compared to, say, tropical coral reefs, they don't look extremely diverse. But the thing is, out of the over 5,000 species of described coral across the world, all the waters, it's estimated that more than half of the corals are actually in cold and deep water environments. So these are extremely widespread and diverse species. Some of them are just single polyps, like one individual animal once, but some of them are reef building like this. And you'd think maybe that nothing can beat a tropical coral reef in size and width and area coverage. But when you look at these ones, the biggest coral reef of these corals that have been found is just off the coast of Norway, and it is 43 kilometers. That's about 27 miles long, which is, for someone who doesn't, if you want to put that into a perspective, that's about the length of 400 soccer fields, which is, to me, absolutely amazing. And you're looking at a coral reef 43 kilometers long in deep water, and it's really cold as well, and it just extends 400 soccer fields in length. That's amazing. On top of that, it's as wide as point is about over 6, close to 7 kilometers wide. So they are pretty significant. The interesting thing in comparison to, say, tropical coral reefs, though, they don't have the same diversity of corals. If you look at a coral reef on the Great Barrier Reef, you're looking at several hundred species of corals making up the coral reef, making it this complex structure. But for the coral reefs here of the Lophelia pertusa coral reefs, you're looking at mostly that species making up the whole extent of the reef. But the diversity of life around the reef is still extremely important, including a lot of commercial species, commercial fish that we depend on for our survival, for example. So the structure is very different. So anyway, so this is part of what I feel is super fascinating with biodiversity, and super fascinating about areas that we normally don't get to talk about or get to see in real life, that still holds these extremely important and interesting species. So I'm building up a whole structure. I'm building up a whole project on several of these species. This is one example that's just really close to heart because of my marine background, and that I feel really passionate about. And there's a whole lot that needs to be done to make sure that these species, these reefs, remain and won't get destroyed, because right now they are under pretty heavy pressure from overfishing, destructive fishing methods, and also other things. Oil and gas drilling has also been named as one of the potentially big threats to these coral reefs because of the increased sedimentation that comes in the water that kind of brings up a lot of stuff from the bottom that then gets transported to these reefs and could damage them. But the good thing is that they are located in deep, kind of constant environments where the temperature is pretty cold constantly, and also it's usually very strong currents on these reefs, which helps clean the reefs, helps transport away sedimentation and that kind of stuff, so it doesn't get stuck on the reefs as much as it would if it was in still water. So that's a really it's one of the really important things here. So what I'm doing right now is I'm collaborating with commercial divers and scientists, and we're trying to document some of the species that you will see on these reefs as well. First of all, this one is a really interesting one. This is a worm. I borrowed this picture partly because I was hoping that I was going to actually have actual footage to show you this for this session, but the problem is that because of this corona situation that we're in right now, I have not been able to get out, of course. Just like many of you, I'm kind of stuck at home and just organizing things. So we haven't been able to actually get out there yet, but it's going to happen pretty soon when things calm down. So this worm is one of the symbiotic organisms that live on these cold water corals as well. It actually helps, it kind of wraps around the coral structure, and then the coral kind of builds around it, making the coral structure stronger, and also helps protect it from attackers from the outside, of predators on the coral as well. And also this is Oliver, who is one of the commercial divers here in some of the gear that will be used for the dives that are going to happen on the coral reefs, hopefully sooner than later. And we're going to be documenting some of that stuff. And it's not an easy thing. This is what a commercial diver has to go through. This is part of the dive table. Just want to show you. It's going to be, it takes a whole lot more planning. If you guys are divers, you know that it's not that difficult to dive. When it comes to diving to 100, 110 meters, it's a whole different story with new gas mixes to make sure that we stay safe, and also making sure that you do stops along the way up to prevent any damage. It's pretty serious business. So time flies when you're talking about something that you're passionate about, and this is again just one of the things that I'm doing right now when it comes to documenting biodiversity. My passion is trying to find species that I think people will find interesting, stories that I think people would find interesting if they only knew they existed. And give me a comment if you like, if you knew that there were if you knew that there were cold deep water coral reefs 43 kilometers in length. I would love to hear if any one of you actually knew that existed, and how many of you did not know that existed. So I'm going to take a couple of questions here that I found. I've already run out of time, so I'm going to have to quit here. And hopefully you found this interesting. Leave your comments in the comments box below here if you have any comments, and make sure you check out all of the other talks here for on Lizzie Daly's Earth Live lessons. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks for listening. All right, bye.